and political violence at King's College. He joins us from central London to try and shed a little light on this. Doctor, thanks very much for being with us. Can you just start by explaining, for those who don't know, the distinction between the distinction that many people draw between the mainstream of Islam and those who become known as the jihadists, the Salafis, the Wahhabis that are said to exist on its fringes?
Well, what we find is there are multiple traditions within Islam, multiple schools of thought, and the area that I focus on in particular is Salafi-Jihadism. The term Salafism itself has been conflated with terrorism and violent extremism in sort of popular discourse over the last few years. But what I've attempted to show is that, in fact, Salafism, although quite a literalist strain of Islam, has a number of adherents within it who are on the whole actually mostly quietists and so on, but there is a sort of a strain within it which is violent, which is rejectionist, which believes in upheaval and challenging political orders, society and status quo in the way that we're seeing, not just here in the last few days, of course, but in general around the world.
You'll have been watching those pictures that we were of the religious leaders from the three Abrahamic faiths coming together. I mean, part of the problem that people have with trying to understand where this violence from within parts of Islam comes from is to do with the fact that, yep, certain religions, I mean, Catholicism amongst them, have different interpretations of the religious text. But at least with the Catholic faith, you have the magisterium, you have the ultimate authority. That does not exist within Islam. So there are opportunities for those who wish to take the faith in a different direction to do so with some justification from the religious text.
Right, and I think we need to be very careful and very clear on this, but the public discourse, again, tends to be very polarized between those who say, on the one hand, this is violence and terrorism and extremism is inimical, it is intrinsic, and it's a natural product of Islamic scripture, and this is what Islam fundamentally is in its composition. On the other hand, you have people saying it's got nothing to do with Islam, this could never be a reading of it, and so on. In fact, when you look at Islam, Islamic texts, and the various bodies of Islamic literature that exist as sources of law, then these are open to lots of interpretation, and they can be constructed in a number of different ways. Of course, we know lots of people who are very devout, who follow Islam in completely peaceful, completely integrated, modern ways, and get on with their normal lives. But there are clearly numbers of people in this country, in Europe, in the West, and of course in the Middle East as well, who do construct Islam in a particularly nihilistic way, in a confrontational way, in a way that does promote violence. And so these are all various constructions. And what I think is interesting is to look behind that and to say, well, what would motivate somebody to, in the first place, put forward a construction of Islamic scripture that is either rejectionist or violent in this way, and then what attracts people to that? Ultimately, these people are electing to go for that opinion or to go for that choice, that reading of the text, and are therefore electing to subscribe to an ideology in a way that anyone else might subscribe to anything else.
Can we generalise then, Dr. Maher, about what it is about those teachings, the more nihilistic teachings as you describe them, some of which tend to occur in the latter parts of the Hadith? What is it about those that prove so attractive to people? We've been looking at photographs of Khalid Masood this morning as what we assume to be a 14-year-old five-a-side footballer. There is such a gap between that and the acts that he committed the other day that it's difficult to comprehend, the intellectual leaps that he must have had to perform.
There isn't really ever a simple one-size-fits-all solution to any of this. Ultimately, we're dealing with individuals, with people who have their own life experiences, trajectories, and so on. What we are seeing, though, if you look at the pattern of terrorist violence, Islamist terrorist violence in particular, of course, over the last 15 years, more recently with the conflict in Syria, people who have elected to travel out there, and then people who have, off the back of that, committed terrorist atrocities back at home in the West, in Europe, and North America, and so on, is that there are a number of things at play. Yes, there are ideological factors. There are sometimes behind that or sitting alongside that other factors that for different people have different stresses. So for some people there may be social deprivation, for others there may be economic factors. In a number of cases, none of those things are present. So we're really trying to find something, a sort of silver bullet that I don't think really exists. This is a very complex phenomenon. But one thing I would say, and that I tend to lean towards quite heavily, is that fundamentally behind all of this sits the issue of identity and integration. And when you see this, when you think of it, no one goes home and burns down their own house. That's something you feel a part of. It's your space. It's something you have an emotional attachment and sentimental connection to, in the way that we do with our families, our loved ones, our belongings, and so on. When you get these homegrown cases of radicalization, it's fundamentally the fact that these people have not felt integrated, they don't feel connected, they don't feel British when these events take place here, or they don't feel French when it happens in France, or German when it happens there. And this really does drive at a really serious long-term issue, because of course I'm not the first person to sit here on Sky News and talk about this. We've been talking about this for 15 years, maybe longer. We really have to think about how we build positive citizenship with people so that they feel part of our country and our society.
Dr. Shiraz Maher, Senior Fellow at the King's College's International Centre for the Study of Radicalisation and Political Violence. Many thanks for joining us.